Okay, so Aristotle is the logical author to follow up a day of Plato with. Said it before, we'll say it again. Kind of thing I might put on a quiz in a few weeks. Among our ancient Greek philosophers, Socrates was a teacher of Plato, and Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. And you'll find that a lot of the themes we started to be introduced to in the Plato excerpts we went over are very much on Aristotle's mind in his writing, although he'll end up taking a completely or an often very different approach to the same subject matter. So I think the goal for, or I should say, my hope for kind of takeaways from this half of the class, I'm going to try to give takeaways to keep an eye on for each of our sessions, is to get an idea of Aristotle's idea of virtue, which is the concept that really anchors his whole ethical philosophy. And we'll start to see that virtue, according to Aristotle, while it's sometimes confused with mere habit, is much more than just that. The key word will be virtue as a mean between different kinds of extremes. The other takeaway I hope we get from this half of the class is some understanding of what the good is, according to Aristotle, what the highest thing in human life might be. And that'll provide a segue into our second sort of section on Aristotle when he talks about friendship and the political life. But takeaways for now, hope it really is centering on Aristotle's ethics, often called virtue ethics. So to kind of set the stage, so previously mentioned, I'm not going to quiz you on dates, and this is not a history class, but just to kind of orient ourselves in space and time. Aristotle, like I said, lived and worked overlapping with Plato, but also after Plato. And there's no way that I could overstate Aristotle's influence on philosophy and many other fields for literally centuries after he died. Like Plato and some of the other authors on our syllabus, he's one of these just towering world-class thinkers who seem to write about everything under the sun. And we'll get a closer look at that in the next slide. He wrote not only about ethics and political philosophy, he also did authoritative work in science, especially biology, logic. Aristotelian logic for a long time was the dominant way of practicing logic. And that was for something like 1,000 years. And I'm going to cut myself off just because it is loudly thundering, and I'm going to close my window. So give me just one moment. Okay, hopefully you can hear me a bit better. So Aristotle was viewed as an authority on many different aspects of thought for something close to 1,000 years. And it wasn't until we get to the modern era in kind of Western philosophy and thought that Aristotle would come under attack for a couple of reasons that we'll touch on today. A very small example of Aristotle's status as this kind of authority in philosophy and other realms of human thought comes from a later philosopher, really a medieval pre-Renaissance writer called Thomas Aquinas, an authority in his own right. He was viewed in terms of theology. He definitely digested everything Aristotle ever wrote. And in his own writings, he did not refer to Aristotle by name, even though he constantly called on Aristotle's work. He simply called him the philosopher. It would have been understood by his audience just who he meant. Another biographical kind of factoid about Aristotle Does anyone know who maybe Aristotle's own most famous student was? So we go Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Aristotle definitely educated many philosophers in their own right, but maybe his most famous student was Alexander the Great, which is a fact we might keep in mind when evaluating Aristotle's ethics. Did Alexander the Great, a certifiable world conqueror, exemplify Aristotle's ethics in action? Unfortunately, not a lot is known about the relationship between Aristotle and Alexander the Great, a conqueror of much of the Hellenic world and Asia Minor, reaching as far as India. So we can only speculate. So just to spell out a little bit more, what it was that Aristotle accomplished. This is one bibliography of his works, and you can see that they cover almost everything under the sun and beyond. It's a book called The Categories, Interpretation, Physics, on the Heavens, Meteorology, on the Soul, Metaphysics. I'm going to get back to that word in a few moments. In the middle, we have Nicomachean Ethics, his main ethical work, which the readings for today come from. On dreams, mechanics, generation of animals, biology, embryology, poetics. He wrote an extremely famous book on that topic, which some of you may have been assigned parts of in high school. It seemed like Aristotle gave an authoritative definition of what tragedy is in that book, and was influential on tragedians, playwrights, not only for centuries afterwards, but up to today. There's a way to sort of start to bring a sense of order and comprehension to this big list of works. You can think of them as theoretical science and practical science. Theoretical science is like metaphysics and physics. Practical science, focusing on individuals and social action, ethics and politics. And what might be termed productive sciences, like poetics and rhetoric. Interesting note is that in the period of ancient philosophy we're talking about, and for a long time afterwards, mathematics and science were not viewed as separate from philosophy. Maybe some of you are or will become a math major or a science major. There's not a lot of overlap between the math department and the science department at City College and the philosophy department, or maybe the political science department. And I'm sure it's that way everywhere in the country, if not the world. But in Aristotle's time, and like I said, for a long time afterwards, the natural sciences and math, but really more the natural sciences, were viewed as a part of philosophy. One term for biology or for physics would have been natural philosophy, and Aristotle would embody a sort of view of reality as a totality, in which his theory of biology closely complements his theory of physics, his theory of metaphysics, and his understanding of the way reality works as a whole, down to the level of the individual soul.
Then like the
and okay, I do see, I'm not sure if someone's trying to chime in, but I do see a hand raised. Evelyn, yes.
So, Professor, that's something that I asked you in the beginning is why has, for example, so we're seeing all these philosophers at the beginning were like so intellectual at every level. I mean, they were trying to learn as much as possible, not just one subject. But now this is the thing about modern philosophy that I have noticed. It has divided into too many fields, but these fields are concentrating just in that field, not as diverse as these philosophers were. And obviously I feel like now philosophy is kind of shortcut. It has been like cut off a little bit, because yes, you can have a scholar that's very educated in what subject, but probably if you ask him to another subject, he'll be like, oh, that's not my campus. It's just limited. It has become limited in a certain way.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I agree. um, and yeah, I tend to think that the humanities and the sciences are just like too specialized. Like at graduate school and a philosophy department, I mean, if you talk to a student or a faculty member and ask, what do you do? They won't just say I do philosophy, but the answer will be like a very detailed, specific response. Um, I work not just on metaphysics, but like a subset of metaphysics, which is called natural, the problem of natural kinds. And on the side, I do a little bit of epistemology, and that's it. And that person might not know like anything else about, a field that might be not too far. You would think is not too far, but the student or professor will say that it is. I mean, I think it's too bad that academia tends to work that way these days. I mean, once in a while you encounter someone who's very good and knowledgeable about a lot of different things. I don't think you see it that much these days. I mean, over specialization. We can talk about why that is. Trying to put it into. I mean, I think one part of that is simply practical, and it's like literally a career thing for people. If you're an academic or an intellectual, you try to separate yourself and distinguish yourself by being like really great at this one thing, but then you end up like not knowing anything at all about a lot of other fields. So it's a problem. Trying to bring it back to Aristotle, I mean, I think it's a long time after Aristotle that, in my opinion, philosophy effectively has a divorce from math and science. But it's a good question to keep in mind when we ask, why is Aristotle not acceptable today? Like, why is his worldview not acceptable today? His view of a totality, of reality as a totality, where there's on some level, which I'll get to the next slide, a unity between the human soul, the human city, and the earth and the cosmos. So I think the philosophical basis for that kind of worldview crumbled centuries after Aristotle lived and worked, and maybe an after effect, or you could partially consider this hyper specialization where philosophers or other fields are ultra concentrated in like just one subset and like totally ignorant about everything else. That might be a late consequence of the sort of crumbling of the Aristotelian worldview that seems to have considered all of reality to be in harmony with itself. So it would make sense that if you want to understand the soul on an ethical level, you have to know its place in nature, and you end up having to understand all of reality put together. So I'm glad you raised it. I mean, I think it's a really productive way of thinking about this incredible array of work of Aristotle. And it's also a good transition to our next slide. One other thing I'll say about Aristotle is, on this slide, is so we can compare him to the present, where everyone's hyper specialized but also ignorant about a lot of things. You can also compare him to his predecessor. A key difference between, I can keep it to Socrates versus Aristotle, as opposed to Plato versus Aristotle, because they do have a lot of overlap in what they're interested in. Socrates, actually, in the reading or in the dialogue that the first excerpt for last week came from the Phaedo, Socrates basically says he embarked on philosophy to find out what is responsible for things coming to exist, passing away, and being as they are. And he ends up abandoning the sciences as a means for doing that. And he ends up embarking on what he calls a second sailing, a sort of second effort in the form of the theory of the forms. That becomes his next best explanation for reality. But he seems to abandon this idea of trying to come up for an account of the world as a whole. Aristotle, that phrase would be one way for describing Aristotle's work, is that he wants to come up with an account for reality in all of its aspects. And in a way could be seen as continuing the project that Socrates at least said he abandoned. Okay, so another framework to keep in mind once we will get to the ethics today. And it's comparing Aristotle to more recent theories of the human being and the natural world. I think the comparison I want to sort of sketch is between a conception of the world as fundamentally stable, in which everything has an ultimate aim or purpose. That's Aristotle's world, compared to what I would call a post-Darwinian world that conceives of the natural world as unstable, in which every living thing does not necessarily have an ultimate aim or purpose. But before I say anything else in that vein, who here can tell everyone who Darwin was and what his main idea may have been?
Wasn't he just, oh, it's been a while, but I guess biologist, essentially, mainly known for, natural selection stuff.
Yes, you said the magic word I was fishing for. So, and what is natural selection?
I mean, you kind of have all the answers up there, but, like, it's the theory that most things either evolve or die based on their surroundings, so like nature versus nurture.
Yeah, absolutely. So Darwin was one of the main theorists and contributors to the idea of evolution, the concept that animal species change over time. And this change takes place through I'm not a biologist at all, so this is just my general paraphrase of it, that species change over time. And the changes are a product of the natural world being in competition with itself, in which the fittest survive. So negative traits, harmful traits, unhelpful traits are discarded. And then over the process of eons, species change and transform. So that's probably a view we're more or less familiar with. But it makes it hard to unearth what it is Aristotle was talking about. He had a view that's as close to the opposite as I can think of the Darwinian view.
Professor, can I say that I do agree with Aristotle, and I think he actually was the closer when it comes to our modern quantum theories and stuff. I think he was probably the closer philosopher at that time that probably was way more aware of things that now in our modern time we probably are discovering. And I do think, for example, Darwin, he was observing animals. And when we think about it, humans are not animals. And if we were to reason, because humans are capable of reasoning, and we were to act with reason everything we do, I would say Aristotle was right. But with our modern society and all the things that we have created, I think we have embraced Darwin theory, and that's the way we behave now.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so you said a lot of interesting things. I can't speak to Aristotle compared to quantum theory, because that's not my thing. But the idea that, I mean, I think you've hit on what I was, part of what you said is what I was trying to express. I mean, Darwin, I think in indirect ways, is hugely influential on the way a lot of people tend to think about reality as something that's unstable. And where Aristotle will be different is in conceiving the natural world as stable, and in fact, maintaining that everything has an ultimate aim. So for Darwin, there's no species, no person has an ultimate goal or purpose, except for maybe sheer survival. But Aristotle will conceive of the natural world and extending it to human beings as saying each by nature has a permanent, unchanging essence. And with that essence sort of prescribes a purpose or a telos, an ultimate aim. So just as a knife has a purpose, or a horse has a purpose, or a house has a purpose, so a human being has an unchanging essence and an unchanging purpose. So the challenge is, in the realm of ethics, I mean, it's not quite as simple as that. It all depends on which framework you're looking at the subject under discussion through. But the challenge in ethics will be understanding human purpose in the sense of right action or right conduct. So hopefully that distinction is a bit clear. And I think it would indirectly address Evelyn's question. Why are things so specialized now? It's like, well, no one, at least in most mainstream thought, with some major exceptions, agrees with this Aristotelian worldview in which reality is fundamentally unchanging. Everything has an essence, and there's an ultimate aim or purpose to an individual human life, and that the sciences and arts can complement each other to yield that worldview. If that worldview is gone, then the arts and sciences are going to become much more separate, and maybe a late consequence of that will be specializing on certain things and ignoring other things.
I jump on what Evelyn had said.
I didn't quite hear you. Do you mind repeating that?
Oh, I said, can I jump into like what
Yeah, by all
Evelyn
means.
had?
Yes.
It sort of reminds me of like with the distinction with like Darwin and Aristotle stuff, is that like even now you see people like try and justify like messed up stuff that I guess people do and say, well, it's just human nature, or people just act belligerently and stuff like that. Or in terms of like, I don't know, like capitalistic stuff, like it's called like companies and stuff, like they don't survive the business and stuff. It's just essentially like business Darwinism and stuff.
Yeah. No, those are great examples that I think can illustrate what I was trying to talk about. If you conceive of reality, the natural world, as a state of constant competition and try to apply it to human beings, that can lead to ugly things. Cutthroat business practices, survival of the fittest. Crime, survival of the fittest. But Aristotle could provide an explanation for why businesses should not act in a cutthroat manner. Why, for example, an energy company shouldn't dump tons of chemicals into a river just to like make more profit or something. Like maybe, you can extrapolate an ethical justification from a Darwinist view of nature, but Aristotle will disagree with that. It can often seem very simplistic to come across this idea from Aristotle that every living thing, including humans, has an ultimate purpose or goal, but it can also be very empowering. It can provide an answer, it comes from his ethics. So yeah, it's stable. An idea of reality as stable will give a counter argument to those things like, Wall Street is just survival of the fittest. War, survival of the fittest. No, you can take Aristotle's ethics and say there should be rules of war. There is such thing as a just or unjust war, and related questions. I see it in chat. Nature versus nurture. Yeah, I mean, this is a huge theme for Aristotle, which we can get to. So with this idea that everything in the natural world has an ultimate aim or purpose, that raises the immediate question on the ethical level, what might that ultimate aim or purpose be for a human being? I think this came up at the beginning of our class today. I think a lot of contemporary thought tends to see human life as highly subjective. There are cultural differences, there are differences in the way someone is raised, environmental differences, all that kind of thing that makes, the idea of an ultimate purpose for individual humans seem absurd. But again, based on that view that human beings do have an unchanging, stable essence, Aristotle will maintain that an ultimate aim for life can be uncovered and actually put into practice is the incredible part. So this kind of inquiry gets the label of ethics, which is something that we're going to return to with a few more authors later in the semester. And I would say a guiding question for the subset of philosophy called ethics is, what is the right or wrong thing to do? That is a quintessentially ethical question. And how do you know what the right or wrong thing to do is? And he starts off, and this is in the reading for today, by kind of conceiving human beings in terms of the work they do. Did anyone recall the analogy he kind of makes between, I think it's a flute player and a human being? And what point does he try to get at with that? So I know the photocopies are not that user-friendly, which is something I need to work on, but it's in chapter 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle states, there's the work of a flute player is to play the flute well, and it is the mark of a serious flute player. That is the mark of a serious flute player. And then he goes on to state, it can't possibly be the case that there's something it means for a flute player or a musician or a house builder or a general to do their work well, but there not be something it means for a human being to do its work well. And so the question for him becomes, what is the work of a human being, and how is it done well? Like that shapes this inquiry for him. What is the ultimate aim for a human? And I'll go off on a digression because this is an undergraduate class, and suggest, whether or not you buy anything from the rest of Aristotle, that question, that sort of cluster of questions, is there an ultimate aim in life for a human being? What does it mean for a human being to do its work well? Are not bad ones to apply when thinking about life decisions in general. Like, I would think that this question, is there an ultimate aim in life? And the related question, what does it mean for a human being to do its work well, would shape things like, what is your major? Like, it might sound ridiculous, but I mean, that would be like an immediate application of Aristotelian philosophy. And then after you graduate, what career do you take? How do you conduct yourself during that career? And then a whole bunch of side questions can come up. Do you do a major because you think it's the one that will best prepare you for a stable career? That's like a great reason. It's a very practical reason. Do you pick a major because it's your passion? I'm kind of drawn to that, obviously. Like, I picked philosophy. It's not very stable career-wise. And do those choices tie into the idea of a higher aim, or do we just kind of assume a higher aim comes into focus along the way? I think these sort of ethical questions Aristotle makes encourage us to sort of build them into actual real world decision making. And putting this again in the context, sort of to emphasize his essentialism, the idea that human beings have an unchanged fundamental essence. It's his presupposition for the ethics. The fact that the question, what's the right or wrong thing, and how do you know what the right or wrong thing to do is, suggests that we do not enter the world with all of the answers. That might be a hint at Aristotle's reality that human beings enter the world in an imperfect state. But I think that his ethics also presuppose, because of his view of human nature and all animal natures as being having an underlying reality that is unchanging. They can also be perfected. And each human being could attain perfection in a somewhat similar way. And the way to do that is through ethics. So it's a very, I mean, it's a simple way of putting it, but it's also, I think, a very powerful model for thinking about the world, the personal and social world of human beings. You enter in an imperfect state. There's a perfection that can be aspired to if the ultimate aim of a human is uncovered. And the way to achieve that aim is through ethics. And what some conservative-minded philosophers will say is that this marks a huge distinction between Aristotle and subsequent philosophers in the modern era. They will give you the human being in its imperfect state. They will give you ethics in great detail. Tremendous works of ethics have been written in the modern era and since. But because they don't have that Aristotelian idea of essence, especially if they're writing after Darwin, they've been obliged to abandon the idea of a perfect condition of a human being. So the ethics that for Aristotle are a bridge between an imperfect state and a perfect state end up leading nowhere. Would be a sort of more conservative criticism of more recent ethical thought. Let's see if there's anything else I wanted to say about this. Any comments at this point? Does this make sense? And maybe someone who hasn't spoken yet, if they want to chime in. Okay, don't be shy if you haven't spoken yet. And if you have spoken, thank you, and please keep speaking.
Professor,
yes.
Can I say my point of view on this? I do agree with him, and like I said, for me, he's the one that makes the most sense, because the thing that he employs the most, and it's something that we as humans we refuse to do, is personal responsibility for our own stability, whether it's emotionally, spiritually, or at level. We're responsible for ourselves to create a better version of ourselves, grow with every stage over time, and I think this is what Aristotle implies. But I do think we refuse to do that, because it would take, for example, how many years he spent on being a student, 22 years. Imagine us being in a college for 22 years. That's half of our life, like 1/4, like 1/5 of our life, whatever. But I mean, it takes years, it takes dedication. But nowadays, by the age of 18, you're already in college. You're supposed to choose a career that you apparently love at 18. Without
Right.
being a war that's surrounding around the world, and you just grew up in a bubble in one way. I mean, there's no experience, there's no knowledge in there. You're supposed to choose a career at that age and be happy for the rest of your life. It's like, I think there's more than that. There's way more context than just that life.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, so as far as the first thing you said about responsibility, I mean, I think Aristotle says human beings can and should be responsible for their own conduct. Not everyone is, Aristotle will note, but I think he states everyone can and should be. And the other point you raised, just about how much time ethics can take, I think Aristotle indirectly addresses, not in the reading for today, but he makes it clear throughout this work of his that the excerpts are from, called the Nicomachean Ethics, that ethics applies not just to philosophers, it applies to all people. And I mean, you picked up on, I think, a key issue that comes up when reading philosophers in general and ethical writing in particular, is a lot of times philosophers can seem somewhat conceited or snooty about their theories. And I mean, this is explicit in the Republic, where Plato says, or through Socrates, only philosophers should be rulers. Others are not as blunt, but they'll strongly suggest that in order to be a good person, basically you have to do philosophy for a long time. I mean, as Evelyn noted, yes, I mean, there are people who spend their lifetimes reading Aristotle. That's not how I want to spend my whole lifetime. I'm good with reading some. I'm not going to read all of Aristotle. But for Aristotle's ethics, in keeping with his theme that people can and should be responsible, I think he states that ethical conduct only arises if it is thoughtful and deliberate. So if you just do something as a reflex, that doesn't qualify necessarily as ethical. But I mean, he's pretty explicit at points that ethics are for everyone, that you don't need to digest his whole system and theory of reality. It's that if you can put into practice some ethical principles, then you'll be able to do ethical decision making and lead an ethical life. So hopefully that addresses what you're talking about, Evelyn. Because yeah, I mean, and that appeals to me because I'm not sure I agree with Aristotle, but to the extent I do, I would not want to live in a universe where the only possibility of being a good person was if you were a philosophy major or PhD. I mean, that'd be terrible. And also, that goes against all common sense. So I think Aristotle states, and I think his writing shows that it's possible to be ethical without spending your whole life studying. Okay, so yes, happiness is the ultimate goal. That's another great theme you mentioned in the chat, which will come up toward the end of this class, I think. Okay, so as I said at the beginning of class, the sort of anchor, the conceptual anchor for Aristotle's ethics is the idea of virtue. And the times where I think it's really simple and the times where I think it's complicated. And I think your reading for today, the parts on chapter 2, started to touch on some of this, but not all of it. But it turns out for Aristotle that the ultimate aim of a human being is reached through, and what it means for a human being to do its work well is cultivation of the virtues. Maybe before I start to talk about Aristotle's idea of virtue, I would like to hear some ideas from you. What is virtue? Or what are examples of virtue?
I guess in like the easiest way to explain it's just to do good, not just like for your satisfaction, but for others around you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's key. That's a key part of something like that is a key part of virtue for Aristotle, which we'll get to in the second half of class when he talks about what I consider sort of the two key human relationships, friendship and being part of a political community. So doing good for other people, I think will be a key part or a key example of virtue. But how about what is virtue itself? Okay, Mackenzie wrote in the chat, might be a positive demonstration of character, such as honesty and loyalty. Are honesty and loyalty virtues? That's a good question. But I like the word character here, because my question is, what is character? Aristotle's answer would be something like character is the composite of your features or active conditions that are either virtues or vices. Any other thoughts on this question? Big concern to both Plato and Aristotle. So to start to get us going a bit more, strong moral standard. Yes, maybe virtues yield a strong moral standard or a standard, but let's hold on to the idea of standards, because I think that will be a key part of the definition of virtue. One of Aristotle's statements is that every virtue puts into good condition that of which it is a virtue and enables it to perform its work well. So if an eye is in a good condition, and this is an actual example from Aristotle, then a person will see well. The virtue of a human being, to finish this quote, will be such a condition as makes a person good and perform his proper function well. So somehow this gets at a very active idea of what a virtue is. It's not a static condition that you just kind of attain and then kick back and say you're really virtuous. It seems like a process of work, and it's work at the very feature that makes one carry out their human functions well. Another word that's often glossed for virtue is excellence. A virtue is a kind of excellence. Some attribute that is attained and maintained at its highest level. So the virtue is being conceived as human attributes in their most perfect, in their highest, in their excellent form. Virtue in that sense, I want to hold on to that part of virtue, which is kind of multifaceted, but virtue in that sense, or that's the sense of virtue that Machiavelli seems to have in mind, and we're going to encounter him in, I want to say, 2 weeks. So he'll say some things that seem to be radically opposed to Aristotle, but he'll be using the same word as him in Italian as instead of ancient Greek, virtue. So virtue is a kind of excellence. Then Aristotle says a bunch more things about this key concept of his. The key acknowledges that people have desires and needs. There are lazy habits. And in different aspects of human character, the challenge is to counterbalance them with good habits. But I think this, for Aristotle, is not merely a process of mindless repetition. It's not like some households do this with children. Every time you swear, put $1 in the swear jar or something. Or you can think of all other kinds of things. I think there are programs to quit smoking. Every time you have a cigarette or want a cigarette, you get some kind of punishment. So it's not just kind of mindless repetition to break bad habits and have superficially good, that would lead to superficially good habits. For Aristotle, deliberation and thoughtfulness have to be sort of fused into one's habits to turn them from just being kind of passive activity to being a richer, fuller, active activity. And if, when cultivating good habits with thoughtfulness in different areas of human activity, you end up kind of deliberately holding yourself in a certain way regarding your feelings and desires. One view of Aristotle is that he doesn't say a virtuous person is the one who's successfully repressed bad desires lazy habits and feels pain when they have to avoid a bad desire. It's that they cultivate a condition in which they desire the right things. I think that sort of framing is part of what gives Aristotle's theory its power. He's saying virtue is not a matter of becoming a robot that automatically does things. It's becoming a person who, if you have cultivated these attributes, these excellences in a certain way, and do this in a thoughtful way, you've attained an active condition of having virtue. Fortunately, not much of this is in the reading for today. A lot of this is my kind of attempt to describe Aristotle's analysis of virtue. But does this make sense? Or are there any questions?
Yes, before the caveat at the end, you had, I assumed that just like the way, I guess, it was being described, sounded like you wanted people to be more like angelic in a sense, as opposed to just like until you said like at least working on it, that they should already be doing this, or if they don't do this, they're not, virtuous. But if they actually try and work on it, then they would become virtuous.
Yeah, I mean, I think Aristotle would acknowledge that human beings do not enter the world as angels. I'm not 100% sure what you meant by angels. I mean, a virtuous person is not flawlessly perfect. It's someone who has to work to attain these positive attributes. In the next slide, we're going to give a few specific examples. But yes, it's an ongoing process of work, and it's thoughtful work is the main thing I kind of want to emphasize. Does that address what you meant?
Yeah.
And then, but I think another theme of Aristotle is that, because in a sense, if you've spent some time cultivating these different attributes into excellences that are virtues, I wouldn't say virtue is situational, just that human life will present constant situations where there aren't necessarily easy answers, but the idea will be having virtuous character will enable someone to do the work to respond virtuously to a given situation. And I see in the chat, yeah, I mean, self-discipline would be a significant part of virtue, I would think. And in the slide on the left, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it is a famous quote from Hamlet, which I think touches on this theme. Virtue, if you have it not, custom will enable you to do it more easily the next time. I mean, I think the quote from Hamlet is an example of the kind of beginning of cultivating virtue, but the part that misses out, this quote from Hamlet is that repetition makes things easier. If it's abstaining from a bad pleasure, in this case, this is Hamlet admonishing his mother. But the missing part is thoughtfulness, that there has to be some deliberation and intentionality as a part of virtue.
That's a little ironic coming from Hamlet.
What do you mean?
I feel like he was virtuous because he was born to royalty, but when it came to common sense and applying himself like currently, I think he felt miserable on that.
I think that Hamlet would not be considered an example of a virtuous person according to Aristotle.
Yeah, revenge was his main thing, and
And also, I mean, if you think about his character over the course of the 5 acts of the play, he's totally erratic, right? I mean, his actions are inconsistent, crazy. I mean, I think a virtuous person, part of the idea that Aristotle is trying to express is that, they do the work to attain excellences of character, but they exhibit them through a kind of stability Emma's too crazy for that, I think.
Yeah, kind of was driven through vengeance and just became insane and essentially kind of normal. So
Yes, and it ends in tragedy. Okay, so a bit more about some of the specifics of virtue. To me, I think this thing to emphasize for the hoped for takeaway for today about Aristotle's concept of virtue, is trying to emphasize in the previous slide that virtue is an active condition attained not just through repetition, but thoughtful deliberation that enables someone to hold themselves kind of in a steady position to act in a virtuous way. So the other sort of key aspect of virtue to my mind, we'll talk about in this slide, and maybe tell me, looking at this list on the left, cowardice, courage, rashness, stinginess, generosity, prodigality, and so on and so forth. What do these kind of clusters of concepts have in common? How would you characterize them if you go from left to right in each of them?
they're like extremes on.
Yes.
Well, the middle one would be like, I guess, the perfect sense of what a person should be, but the what's it called? The ones on the far left and far right are like the extremes of it, where one is, I guess, in a sense, one's more defensive in nature and the other's like more aggressive, where like someone like cowardice, there would be like more, I guess, what's the word, like self, like they essentially would want to like keep themselves out of harm's way without like thinking of others, while the rashness would be someone who goes in full well knowing and really doesn't care about the outcome, regardless if they survive or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think you got it exactly right that, in each row, the attributes on the left and the right are extremes. The way I would phrase it is the extremes on the left are forms of deprivation, and the extremes on the right are forms of excess. So looking at the first row, cowardice could be thought of as a deprivation or a lack of courage. Rashness could be thought of as an excess of courage, being overly bold. Similarly, stinginess is an absence, it's a deficiency of generosity. Prodigality, or spending too much money, is an excess of generosity. Self-denial, putting yourself down, making yourself small, is a deprivation of a healthy level of pride, whereas vanity is an excessive form of pride, and so on and so forth. So I think what this drives home is these examples illustrate that kind of second key attribute of virtue, according to Aristotle, that I was trying to get at. Virtue, it's the attributes in the middle that are examples of virtue, according to Aristotle. And the virtues to him are a mean. So it's by counteracting bad habits that come from cowardice, that if sort of fused with thoughtful deliberation, over time yield the active condition of courage.
Yeah, it's like well, Evelyn had said it in the chat, but like all of it has to do with when you're, I guess, like you were also saying, like if you're around that, a lot of it has to do with like, as Evelyn had said, like self-discipline and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. I mean, it's when you start to really think about these terms and read the Aristotle, you can get different impressions of what these clusters of characteristics mean. Because he states that in one sense they're mean. These would seem to be the attributes of a level-headed person. But on the other, Aristotle also states there's a sense in which they're extremes, because these are the attributes that humanity at its best has. And he mentions most people are not highly virtuous. Most people have an average level of virtue. So there's a question, you don't have to be a philosopher to be virtuous, but there is something difficult about virtue that makes it relatively rare for people to attain these superlative characteristics that have this almost paradoxical character of being, on the one hand, a mean between extremes, but on the other, insofar as they represent the sort of peak of what it means to be a human, are a kind of extreme. I think there's a couple of examples that can flesh this out a little bit more.
I think it's interesting how the way that it's kind of written. So like courage, generosity, proper pride, modesty, like the good traits are written in the middle, whereas like cowardice is like, I don't know, like looking at it. And it's interesting because like there's the topic of duality, so like good and bad. And then and then there's also the idea of like the world is black and white. So and then a lot of people like the phrase like, oh, let's find a middle ground. So I think that kind of correlates with this. And then it's interesting because you have cowardice, but then like the good is that is like being courageous. But if you're too courageous, it could lead to rashness. So that's also interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think that this sort of, these clusters of ideas, yeah, they drive home that virtue is not actually black and white, to use your phrasing just now, Samaya. It's more complicated than that. It's a matter of, I mean, we could think of, I mean, middle ground, I think, is not a bad way to describe it. It is, again, on the one hand, a kind of middle ground between extremes, while itself being a kind of superlative in a different sense. And I think when you start to think of these things in terms of examples, most people would use it as a mask. That's a very good question. But I think that, or it's a very good point. But I think it seems clear, Aristotle would say, if someone's just pretending to be virtuous or doing seemingly virtuous acts just through mindless repetition, if they're not kind of fused with thoughtfulness, then they're not really virtuous. But I think, yeah, so as far as, yes, who one is inside and outside the home can be two very different things. But then the question is a virtuous different in public and then in private? Again, that's where I would think that Aristotle thinks part of the constancy, the constant work of being virtuous means being virtuous in one's dealing both with family and friends at home and in public. Although maybe there's room for debate on that. So a few quick examples before we take our break. This one's a bit strange, so I'll be brief about it. If you can see on the right, and I'm not quite sure how the screen appears to you. This is an example of a sheepdog with sheep. I did not come up with this. This is from a scholar who suggested that the way one attains this mean is something like the way a sheepdog herds sheep. So I've never seen a real life sheepdog, but I've seen them in movies. And what they do is they get sheep to move from point A to point B. So if a sheepdog is too far away from a pack of sheep, they'll lose their organization and scatter, and they won't go where they're supposed to go. On the other hand, if a sheepdog is too close to a pack of sheep, barking its head off at them, the sheep will get scared and run away, and then again, they won't get from point A to point B. It is that as a sheepdog finds a mean, a middle ground between being too far and too close, human beings attain their targeted virtue by finding a mean. Another actually human example would be a friend drops by unannounced to visit, and you have a slice of cake in the fridge. So if someone were gluttonous they would eat the whole slice of cake before the friend came inside, or they would hide the cake so the friend didn't even know they had a cake. It's hard to think of the opposite of that. Maybe it's something like being indifferent to the pleasure that comes from eating a slice of cake. You don't care about the cake. That is a kind of deprivation that Aristotle would not necessarily praise either. To him, the virtuous thing is what?
There, even without really asking.
Exactly. Yes, I think Alan said share it. That would be the virtuous thing in that situation. That is a more beautiful act, or that ends up being a beautiful act, and that actually can lead us to a discussion of another key Aristotelian term. But I think for now, let's take a break of 5 minutes and no more, and then come back for the rest of Aristotle. So right now it's 3:40. I'm just going to pause for a second, and at 3:45, we'll get back into it. So that example that Alan brought up, that when comparing two extreme possible responses, when a friend comes by unannounced, the virtuous thing to do would be share it, exemplifies another key but also very challenging concept in Aristotle, the idea of the beautiful, sometimes translated as the noble. And this comes up in his context of what is the highest good? A question raised in the first sentence of the first page of his book, the Nicomachean Ethics, and that really comes up again and again and pervades the rest of the work. Yeah. All activities, every art and every action has some aim. Is there some aim, ultimate aim, that encompasses all of these subsidiary ones? Is there something that a virtuous person ultimately seeks, and is it even possible to attain? And Aristotle provides 3 possible answers, which were sketched in the reading for today. He will start to describe that ultimate aim as the good and posit it's the useful or the pleasurable or the beautiful, or maybe all 3. And my question before going over Aristotle's discussion of some of these terms for all of you is, what do these words mean to you? And is there any alternative Aristotle might have missed when he's trying to define what the highest good might be? So Evelyn wrote in the chat, happiness. Yeah, I mean, I think that the idea of happiness is very closely related to the highest good for Aristotle, but maybe happiness is attained through the highest good. I mean, there are different ways you could try to phrase it or try to understand between the two of those things. If there's a highest good, then, and you don't have it, presumably you have not attained the fullest human potential for happiness. So other suggestions. So Edwin put in the chat, peace. I think that's a very interesting one to me, because I would tend to think of peace as absence of conflict, but I'm not sure what Aristotle would have to say about that, given how much his depiction of human reality seems to include conflict. I mean, there's this constant struggle almost to counterbalance bad habits with good ones in a deliberate way, and to hit upon the mean, which both can be seen as an intermediate point and also an extreme. So if peace is not absence from conflict, then what is there an active condition for peace? That would be a really interesting question to me. It might be a good essay. Caring for others. Ensuring a better life for ensuring a future better life for the generations that come after us. Love. That's an interesting one. Where love fits in for Aristotle, I'm sure a lot could be said about that. It is interesting, though, that when talking about a possible highest good, he doesn't seem to talk about love much. So is that something that he missed out on? Wanting money, helpfulness in general. Okay, so there are lots of options. There are lots of possibilities. I think these are very thought-provoking ones in the chat.
I have
So
a question.
Mhm.
I guess what is definition of beauty be though?
That is a great question.
Because like, I'm pretty sure you've seen or like know the Hunchback of Notre Dame, right? And like Quasimodo, essentially in that whole like movie is like obviously hideous to say the least, but he'd be considered the most virtuous in that whole story.
Yes. Yeah, I've never actually, it's been like ages since I saw it, I think, as a kid, but I'm familiar with the story. That is, I think, another really thought-provoking example. Is it possible? I mean, I think it's safe to say Aristotle in the Ethics, but the excerpts for today in general, is not talking about physical beauty. I think he would allow for there to be people who have what might be termed a beautiful soul, and and physical appearance doesn't matter at all. I think that might sound corny, but I think it's safe to say Aristotle would agree with that. And my question about the other examples that for your example, I mean, maybe that's not right. My interpretation of Aristotle. But the same question I have for your example as for the other very thought-provoking concepts that were put in the chat is, do those concepts fall under these three major possible aspects or definitions of the highest good, or are they different? So as for the useful, Aristotle does not spend much time entertaining the idea that the highest good is the useful. He seems to think that it is clear that something that's useful or instrumental to another end cannot be the highest good. The only reason for us to pause on it would be that a few weeks from now, we're going to read another major philosopher who presents a moral theory based on what he calls utility. So hopefully we can remember this slide from Aristotle and ask, did Aristotle give utility, something that facilitates attainment of another end, short shrift? Pleasure is very interesting for a lot of reasons. For one, can ask ourselves if we're trying to apply any of this to real world scenarios. I was saying, asking the question, is there an ultimate aim in life, might not be a bad way to frame the question of finding a major or a job. When we look at people we know, we look at our own lives, what role does pleasure play? I mean, yes.
I think it depends what kind of pleasure. There's good pleasure and bad pleasure that got long-term consequences. For example, you might think doing drugs is a little pleasure of yours, but the long-term consequences, I think, will not add up to the pleasure, the moment of the pleasure. I mean, things that got cause and effect, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of times thinking about pleasure in the context of decision making and finding a mean between extremes yields what would be Aristotle's answer. So looking at this attribute of generosity, okay, it could be pleasurable to be prodigal and spend wildly. And maybe it's pleasurable if you hoard money or something. But the idea for Aristotle would be the virtuous conduct will be a mean that leads to a pleasure between those things. But also shows how it's difficult to one thing I would emphasize from Aristotle, and unfortunately it's not so much in the readings for today, was that he doesn't look down on or despise or reject pleasure. He seems to acknowledge that it is an important part of human life. I mean, no one would want to live a life, I would think, that has no pleasure at all. But I think for Aristotle, the mark of a virtuous person is wanting the right pleasures and rejecting the wrong ones, even though it might be much harder to put into, much easier said than done. Okay, another thing easier said than done is the beautiful. Sometimes this is translated in Aristotle's writings from ancient Greek to English as the noble. It's a particular Greek word. It's a noun form of the Greek adjective kalos, which we see in some other words like calligraphy, beautiful writing, etc., etc. So what would it mean for an action to be beautiful? Very good question raised by Alan. What would it mean for a life to be beautiful? That is something very hard for me to try to answer, other than I could give you a few examples Aristotle provides. He writes, unfortunately not in the reading for today, but elsewhere, it is a beautiful thing to do favors for someone freely without expecting a return. Even in cases of urgent necessity, when there is a choice about whom to benefit, one should first decide whether the scale tips toward the necessary or the beautiful thing. Another example, to use money to support our parents is always more beautiful than to use it for ourselves. Someone who strives to achieve the beautiful in action would never be accused of being selfish. Then he summarizes, if all people competed for the beautiful and strained to do the most beautiful things, everything people need in common and the greatest good for each in particular would be achieved. For the person of moral stature will forego money, honor, and all the good things people fight over to achieve the beautiful for himself. So clearly, even though it's presented as a question and recurs as a question throughout the Nicomachean Ethics, what the good is, what might be an ultimate aim toward which all human action aspires, it sounds like Aristotle is very heavily weighted toward beautiful as an answer to that question. But it's not an easy, another, yet another framing for it. A beautiful act is something from which, like a beautiful work of art, nothing can be added or subtracted. It's just right. It's in the middle. It's a mean. It's not an easy concept for me. Yes, Evelyn provides an example of what is enough. Not being too rich, not being poor, somewhere in the middle. This is also a good segue to, I hope, another aspect of Aristotle's thought. So we were just talking about the kind of first batch of readings for today. The second gives us aspects of the kind of the two key human relationships Aristotle talks about, which are friendship and being a member of a political community. So I'll just pull up those slides. I need to stop sharing. Nope. So it's possible the first time coming across Aristotle that he can seem a bit cold. I mean, especially the language seems technical in ways, although I think a good translator would say he's not trying to be technical as an end in itself. He's using unusual turns of phrase to get us thinking about what these concepts mean. And presumably he could have just said virtue is a habit, but he used a very different word. The word we ended up with, active condition, is a translation of a Greek word, which is also a bit jarring in the original context. But he can seem a little bit cold and very focused on the individual, almost to the point of depicting a virtuous human being as kind of selfish, aspiring to the beautiful, to just keep being a better and better human being, achieving all of these excellences. But there's a large portion of the Nicomachean Ethics that I think sort of takes people out of isolation and shows them in the social world, which is friendship. And friendship also turns out to be very relevant to his discussion of government, which happens in a separate book called The Politics, which the last excerpts for today are from. So Aristotle in the readings for today describes three kinds of friendship that really, in a way, mirror or complement his discussion of the good. So three possible forms of friendship for him are friendships of use, friendships for pleasure, and friendships based on virtue, which is again going to be the most complicated one. So a friendship of use, Aristotle pretty early on dismisses as a candidate for true friendship. This or that person can be helpful in some respect. A sort of peculiar comment of Aristotle is that when people get older in life, this is the kind of friendship they tend to have more. They hang out with each other less for fun, for pleasure, and more because they're useful to one another. Friendships for pleasure. Aristotle states that this is the most common form of friendship among the young. Seems to entail both seeking pleasures together and being pleasing to one another. I can relate to this. I've had former friends, current friends, we hang out with because it's fun. We hang out with someone because they're funny. Is that real friendship? It might be easy to say, no, it's not, on the one hand. But would you want to hang out with someone it was unpleasant to be around? Of course not. So it's funny. And similarly, you can look at the friendship of use. Would you hang out with someone who's totally useless or totally helpless? Maybe, I don't know. But I guess what I'm trying to say is there might be more overlap between these categories than meets the eye. As for the virtuous form of friendship, it seems to involve two virtuous people either attaining virtue in partnership or doing virtuous things for each other. But you all tell me, how do these, is this an exhaustive list of kinds of friendship? Or maybe another question would be, can you think of any examples?
I'm a bit stuck on the virtuous aspect of it. Like,
What's that?
I'm a bit like confused on the virtuous aspect of it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, thinking back to sort of the first half of class, if we got some idea of virtue as a kind of excellence,
Mm-hmm.
and then, you know, that list that you gave was like a partial list. Although courage actually seems to be one of the main examples Aristotle talks about in the Nicomachean Ethics, is like embodying what virtue is. But let's say a person has the virtues not only on the list from today, but if you think about the virtues from Plato's Republic, that were sort of center of Plato's Republic: moderation, wisdom. Well, that's a different kind of virtue, it's a different species of virtue according to Aristotle. But if you imagine this sort of, let's try to imagine a high, not a perfectly virtuous, but a highly virtuous person. Why do you think they have friends?
I mean, like, as a person, I don't know. I just feel like I guess the virtuous aspect of it sort of comes off as like, I don't know, like you're friends with them like out of pity or something like that.
I mean, that's a interesting point. I mean, and to me, there's a tension when we get into Aristotle's idea of a virtuous friendship,
Mm-hmm.
and a tension between sort of selfishness and companionship. Is the virtuous person just it's so totally in it for themselves that also their relationships with their friends are supposed to be a vehicle to attaining virtue? So that might be a friendship out of pity. Although I think the sort of Aristotelian reply would be, a true friendship is only going to be between two virtuous people. There's nothing you need to pity a virtuous person over.
Well, I guess another way to think about it is like, I guess let's say, like I guess like with like sports teams or something, like two fans of opposing sports teams that are like, you know, have like a strong rivalry and they still manage to still be friends or something, like out of all the odds and stuff. I guess that's the only way I can think of like that in that same vein, like a virtuous friendship.
Yeah, but my thinking would, I mean, that's another interesting example. My thinking would be the bond between fans of rival teams is their love of sports in general, and not the specific, you know, teams they're into. I mean, maybe there are people in the world who are like, I'm a Giants fan, therefore I cannot and will not be friends with an Eagles fan. I mean, it's possible, but I think that would be weird, right? Like, you could see Giants and Eagles fans being friends because they both love sports. But let's bring it back to virtue, because it is a hard, I mean, that's the hard one. Virtue is always going to be the one that presents the philosophical difficulties. Okay, I have a chat comment in the chat from Alexa. You could define it many ways. Each person has their own way of perceiving it as they experience it themselves. Aha, excellent. Another way is wishing the best for your friend, regardless of pleasure or utility. Yes, I think Alexa has given us a key aspect of friendship according to Aristotle, which I think was from the reading for today. And it's sort of academic way of phrasing it would be, friendship is a kind of reciprocal goodwill. So would someone, maybe who hasn't spoken yet today, like to read this passage for us?
I'll read it.
Okay, I'm not sure who said that, but go for it.
Oh, I'm Marcus.
Okay, thank you, Marcus. Go for it.
Okay. A complete sort of friendship that is between people who are good and alike in virtue, since they wish for good things for one another in the same way, insofar as they are good. And those who wish for good things for their friends for their own sake are friends most of all.
Okay, thank you, Marcus. So what does this mean?
So it for example, a friendship, for example, if it's based on respect, on admiration for one each other, um, I think it's a good friendship because I mean you can give back to the other person the same energy that that person puts on you. So you know you can both, for example, accept your differences, but you that respect and that willingness to keep in touch with that person is still there despite being aware of differences. But the good part is reciprocating between both of you. So I think that's a good friendship. For example, I don't see myself being, even though I'm a very friendly person and I keep a respect when friendly with most everybody, but for me, friendship is something that I take very serious because not everybody is your friend, or you can call somebody a friend. Sometimes they're just people you might know by face, but you really don't know them. You really don't know them deep them down for that. I mean, you don't have like a strong bond connection over the years that you have created because it takes time to build bonds, real bonds, to get to know another person, to trust you their secrets, to get judgment. To not take personal, but you're able to establish a big connection within your differences and still respect for each other and grow together as the years go by. So I think that's friendship for me. Like I said, I don't think I could see myself like being friends with somebody that, for example, likes to talk. I see talks behind her friend's back, or is disrespectful, or is very mean, or likes to bully others. No, it's just no. It's out of character for me, and I cannot deal with that.
Yeah. So this idea of respect makes sense to me because I think it's hard for me to imagine being friends with someone I don't respect. But there also has to be something more to friendship, right? Like it's not, respect is necessary in a friendship, but is it enough for a friendship? I mean, there are people who I respect who I'm not friends with. So what is there other than respect that goes into it? I mean, I think respect will be a key ingredient. And again, thinking of it in the concept of virtue, Aristotle's hypothetically virtuous man or woman will respect other virtuous men and women. But that can't be the only basis of friendship, right? I mean, what else? And, the idea that virtuous friendship is one in which good things are wished for one another also sounds right. It's not someone who talks behind the other person's back. Maybe even helpfulness toward one another is a big part of the activity of friendship. But I don't think it's part of the key recipe for friendship. I mean, you have to like the person, right? And there's a difference between like and respect. So I don't know. Maybe I guess what I'm getting is it seems to me that, and also Aristotle, the way he frames it is, in the reading for today is, no one would want to live a life without friends, even if they're highly virtuous or even if they're incredibly wealthy. It's kind of like a cliche figure, the rich person with no friends. Nobody would want to have all of these good things without friendship. It seems like a fundamental and great, part of the ultimate aim in life. I guess my sort of question would be, why do people want friends? Why do people have friends? What is real friendship? I think, this is just my opinion, so everyone come up with your own, but I think that Aristotle helps illustrate what real friendship is, or what the activity of friendship is. It's between virtuous people. They want good things for one another. Maybe they even do things for one another. I think also unstated by him is you can be a virtuous person, but because human beings are social animals, a virtuous act just is not as deep if the people benefiting from it are acquaintances than it would be if they're friends or loved ones. But he doesn't quite say that. But then I do think that there's a part that's missing, which is just maybe someone's being likable. Are virtuous people supposedly so perfect that you can't help but like them? I doubt that. I think you can't help but respect them. I think I can think of and imagine people who are basically good. I don't know if it's a virtuous, but they're boring. Aristotle doesn't touch on that explicitly. So maybe that brings it back to how not all of these concepts are as divorced from each other as might meet the eye. Okay, use is going to be selfish. It's probably the opposite of virtue. But I think pleasure has to be a key part of friendship that Aristotle doesn't really go into that much in his discussion of friendship. He seems a little bit too dismissive of it for my taste.
I feel like
That's my opinion.
pleasure is probably the most self-explanatory though. Because you wouldn't want to be around someone you don't, like to be around.
Yeah, I think my qualm is that, well, Aristotle, I think he does respect pleasure. It's it's part of life. Virtuous person takes pleasure from the right things and shuns the wrong pleasures. In the context of friendship, in the reading for today, he seems to dismiss a friendship of pleasure as sort of an instrumental kind of friendship that puts it more in the category of friendship for use. It seems to me that he overlooks that even, I have to imagine that even in a virtuous friendship, it would not be enough just to respect the virtue of someone else as a peer and do heroic things together. There has to be some element of pleasure or liking or maybe anyway, one man's opinion. I think that friendship also, it's a good segue into the readings from the politics for today. And we have to go very fast, so fast, I'm not sure we're going to get through everything I wanted to for today, but we can try. So Aristotle's political writing, much like Plato's Republic, focuses on government on the level of the city or city-state. So the fundamental context is a place with a couple tens of thousands of people. And he's very aware, I would say, of the passions that shape conduct in the political realm. He points out that excessive self-interest can be harmful to the whole when you're talking about a city. But there's also a sense in which I think the social relationship of friendship both mitigates, the kind of self-centeredness, self-love that can be destructive to a city, and complements Aristotle's idea of citizenship in a virtuous city. And what I mean is, when virtue leads to the pursuit of the good, of performing beautiful deeds, and also doing good things for your friends, that is ultimately helpful to the city. And there's a suggestion in Aristotle. He does seem to have in mind an ideal size for a city-state. The cities that he has in mind are ones not unlike Athens, which we mentioned last week, was actually a pretty small city by contemporary standards. A city in which definitely not everyone's not friends with everyone, but it's not so big that it's impossible for one citizen not to know, if not all, then most of the other citizens, and to have a kind of friendly relationship with them. Maybe not a deep friendship, but one in which there's a kind of sociability, a stake in the other's well-being, and a ground for virtue, where a virtuous citizen will be friendly enough with other citizens that they'll want to do virtuous things for them and not just for themselves. There's a kind of way that I think, hopefully if I was clear, that Aristotle's conception of political relationships mirrors the fundamental social relationship of friendship. So for him, a well-functioning city has to be a bit more than just convivial. There's an investment, a sort of bond between the citizens. Something that when we talk about, we will get to this today, Aristotle's question of treatment of the difference between deficient and correct forms of government. This should raise questions and problems for us when we talk about New York City, let alone the whole country. We live in a city where it's impossible to know everyone else or to even be aware of everyone else. And a lot of times people are very confined to their own, if not neighborhoods, then their neighborhoods plus their career world, or relative or a highly limited, tiny cross-section of the whole city. So Aristotle's political theory could be considered an application of the essentialism that we were talking about near the beginning of class. And in a very famous and I think rich passage in the Politics, which is in the readings for today, Aristotle states that a human being by nature is a political animal. I think that there's a lot of implications for that. First of all, it goes without saying that when Aristotle and other political philosophers are using the term political, they're not using it in the contemporary sense of Democrats and Republicans or parties. They're trying to talk about, and especially Aristotle, politics in the most fundamental sense, political life derived from the word we encountered last week, the polis, the city, the Greek word for city-state, of or pertaining. The political would be that which pertains to the city, city-state, the city as a totality. And around the same passage in which he states a human being by nature is a political animal, I think he spells it out and kind of defines his term political in this context as meaning meant for a city. A human being by nature is meant for a city. And just as a hand, in his analogy, is incomplete when it's not part of a body, it's a lifeless thing, a human being being a political animal is incomplete outside of a city. And so the city starts to be, in Aristotle's treatment of it, the one arena in which human beings can truly flourish and truly attain virtue. So politics will start to seem like the arena in which humans achieve their highest capacity for excellence. The famous quote, which I will read, but unfortunately don't have time to dwell on, is, "One who is no part of a city, either from lacking the power to be in association or from needing nothing on account of self-sufficiency, is for that reason either a god or a beast." We spent a lot of time talking about what that quote means. but I think it drives home the idea that somehow, according to Aristotle, with his conception of what the human essence is, strongly feels that the human home is not a farm, it's not being part of an empire, it's being a citizen in a city-state. So what do those terms mean according to Aristotle? So the city where he worked, where he was not a native, he did not come from Athens, but that's where he lived much of his life, did not consider all of its residents fully enfranchised citizens. I think Aristotle, highly influenced by the context of Athens, considered a citizen someone who takes part in ruling and judging. That is the distinction between a citizen and non-citizen. But also keep in the back of our minds, what is the difference between a citizen and non-citizen in the United States? Are there any duties or obligations that one has and that the other does not have? Basically, I think a key difference between the US now and Athens in around Aristotle's time is that while US citizens are obligated to take part in judging, being on juries, they are not obligated to, and often do not, participate in ruling, being members of government. Yes, great point by Evelyn in the chat. And a city for Aristotle, he's thinking about, while very much influenced by his climate, somewhat in the abstract. A city for him, he's interested in the respect that it's a political association in which ruling and judging activity are organized, and he will call a city just if it is directed at the common advantage, and unjust if it is directed at the advantage of the rulers. One thing that must be mentioned in this context when he's talking about citizens and non-citizens is Aristotle's discussion of slavery, which for him is infamous. Seems like part of his essentialism required him to hold that slavery was a fundamental part of reality, and that led him to fail to condemn slavery. And even though Aristotle talks about conditions under which slaves can and should be set freed, it seems like he failed to see its cruelty and inhumanism as a whole. And many philosophers since Aristotle's time have taken him to task for that. Might come up again when we do a bit of discussion of philosophy of race in a few months. So I want to give a few moments to hopefully have this very convenient way of laying out forms of government according to Aristotle sink in. Kind of thing I would put on a quiz. So like I was starting to say, Aristotle viewing governments in terms of how ruling and judging are organized defines a form of government or a particular government as just or correct if it carries out its actions for the welfare of the whole, and it is deviant if it carries out its actions out of its own self-interest. So that's the fundamental designation, a qualitative designation at the top. And then the columns are simply a quantitative designation, how many rulers there are. Form of government with one ruler is either a kingship or a tyranny, depending on whether it is correct or deviant. The correct form of government with fewer rulers is an aristocracy, government of the best, the meaning of Aristos. The deviant form of government with few rulers is an oligarchy. Oligos means the few. Aristotle notes this is often the wealthy in this form of government. This should give us pause, but the deviant form of government with many rulers, Aristotle calls democracy. The root word of demos meaning the people. The correct form of government with many rulers, he calls constitutional rule or polity, which is a bit of an unfortunate choice of words to my mind, because polity can mean political entity in general, but it's the term that he applies to the correct form of government with many rulers in particular. So unfortunately, I don't have too much time to dwell on it, but Aristotle's classification of democracy as deviant is a bit jarring. But again, he means a form of government with many rulers when it advances its own interest over the city as a whole. If we had more time, I would sort of turn to you and ask for contemporary or historical examples of all of these forms of government. Has there ever been an aristocracy? See this term in the news still. The UK supposedly has an aristocracy.
I mean, we technically still have an oligarchy in the company.
Well, that, my friend, is the question. What do you have in mind with that phrase when you say that?
There's an actual, it's something oligarchy, but like, because I know it's with like monopolies and stuff, and then there's lobbying and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes up. It brings back the point Evelyn raised at the very beginning of class, that many members of Congress are wealthy. Personally,
Yeah.
a criticism. I don't want to impose my own views on anyone at all, but Congress is often criticized for advancing the interests of the wealthy, not the country as a whole. So many people would agree with you, Alan, and say the US either is an oligarchy or is highly oligarchical. Another interesting aspect of this kind of layout is it could be put on top, or the US branches of government could be put on top of this, not just the oligarchy part, but co-equal branches of government are said, there's one that consists of one person, the executive. There's another branch with few members, the Senate, 100. There's another branch with many rulers, the House of Representatives, 435. So this grid, a lot can be done with it. It might also yield insights into our own form of government. There's a lot more that could be said about all of the above. One thing I want to point out about Aristotle in closing touches on something that many people admire about him, especially compared to Plato. And oftentimes students walk away from these two authors who we unfortunately don't get to spend that much time with this semester, although I think themes that they lay out will stick with us for the rest of the semester. A lot of times students walk away preferring one more than the other. Plato seems to be maybe more idealistic. Broadly speaking, the discussion in the Republic is often called an analysis of the ideal city, and the fact that he did not write about existing cities during his time suggests that his ideal can only be attained in theory. It seems harder to extract practical applications from Plato's political philosophy. Aristotle, when people encounter him for the first time, students, can often seem much more practical, both with the ethics we were discussing in the first part of class, he does seem to be describing a theory that could, if you really wanted it to, be put into practice in day-to-day life. It's much harder to imagine how Plato's discussion of the soul, as articulated by Socrates, can be put into practice.
Professor, can I say, for example, that I think democracy, it has some good points. The problem, and probably they work for ancient Greece, which is a very small little country in the Mediterranean. But here's the thing, though: United States is not a small country, and it has, and creating a system of racial a racial system, and being so big, I mean, dealing with immigration all the time, that there's so many problems that probably back in ancient Greece they were not dealing with it. And when you put that democracy being applied to the United States, I think that's a totally different system, and it will like clash.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there are lots of challenges to applying Aristotle to any country today. I mean, the big problem right off the bat is the one that you raised, which is just the scale. The US is immeasurably bigger than Athens of Aristotle's day. The US is much more diverse. Athens had some diversity, but nothing compared to the US, where it's this complicated variety of races and people all over the world. We will touch on that factor, like I said, in a few weeks when we do a bit of philosophy of race. Nevertheless, I do think it is possible to get some takeaways from Aristotle's discussion of forms of government. One of them might be this. This is a note that I'm going to end on for today. In the sort of vein of him seeming to be more practical than Plato, he does provide a sketch of what the best city would be. Attributes, very briefly, include all citizens are virtuous in this environment. They possess property. He goes into details about how they spend their lives, from serving in the military to holding political office to religious responsibilities. This is an aristocracy. Aristotle explicitly acknowledges that this would be hard, if not impossible, to put into practice in the real world. So he also provides a sketch of what he terms, or I think what is termed, a kind of second best city. And this, I think, Evelyn and everyone else could give food for thought about what kind of government we want to live in. It is a mix of aristocracy and polity, mix of rule by the few and by the many. It is not aimed at the cultivation of perfect virtue in all citizens. Like I mentioned last week, that a key concept for both Plato and Aristotle and others in their climate, and a key difference from political thought today, is that whereas today it's more commonplace to think of government as enabling people to attain personal freedom and hindrance from obstacles, a broad consensus among thinkers, including Plato and Aristotle, would have been that government is intended to shape citizens. And Aristotle's perfect city, somewhat like the guardians in Plato's Republic, would be shaped to attain the highest form of virtue. But Aristotle also acknowledges that it may just not be possible. Citizens in the second best or most practical city would have a common form of virtue. Also interesting, very last parting thought, is that in Aristotle's second best city, the middle class, consisting of many citizens, is the one that exerts control. And his argument there, which is touched on in the reading for today, is that the middle class has the benefit that, unlike the rich, it will not become arrogant because of its wealth and power. Aristotle's words. Unlike the poor, it has the liberty and simply the free time to participate in government. So maybe even acknowledging the challenges Evelyn raised for applying Aristotle's political philosophy for the city and country we live in today. A good parting question from Aristotle is, what do we think of his argument for why a middle class should be the one to exert control in government? And to what extent do our forms of government meet or fall short of both his best city and his second best city? So with that said, I think that's a wrap for today. And as I mentioned at the start of class, papers due in 3 weeks. Feel free to email me with any questions, comments, or even a draft if you give me enough time. And other than that, I will look forward to seeing everyone next week when we talk about Descartes. One word about that reading before we actually go. It is pretty long. It consists of 6 meditations. We are going to work our way through all of them. But I realize time is precious, time is limited. So I'm going to email a suggestion for what to focus on in particular for next week. So that I will say, have a good rest of the weekend, everyone. Thank you so much for coming.
Bye. Have a nice day.
Have a
Thank
good
you.
one.
Have a good day.
Have a nice day.